Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting into something different, something that might make you uncomfortable. We're going to question everything you think you know about Five Nights at Freddy's, about William Afton, about who the real villain might be. For over a decade, we've accepted a simple narrative. A man in a purple Sprite, a serial killer in a yellow rabbit suit, the architect of every tragedy that unfolds across pizzerias, underground facilities, and sprawling entertainment complexes. William Afton, the purple guy, the man behind the slaughter, the monster who lured children to their deaths, who experimented with souls and remnant, who destroyed families and left nothing but haunted animatronics in his wake. But what if that story, the one we've pieced together from minigames and phone calls and cryptic newspaper clippings, and what if it's not the whole truth? What if William Afton, for all his terrible actions, for all the blood on his hands, wasn't the mastermind we think he was? What if he was something else entirely? Broken, desperate, obsessed. A man who tried to fix something that went horrifically wrong, only to become the monster everyone believed him to be. We're not here to absolve William Afton. The things he did, the choices he made, they're unforgivable. Children died, families shattered, souls trapped in metal prisons for decades. Those facts don't change. But tonight, we're going to look at the evidence differently. We're going to examine the inconsistencies, the timeline problems, the corporate cover-ups. We're going to ask uncomfortable questions about Fazbear Entertainment, about Remnant, about who really knew what and when. Because if William Afton wasn't the villain, not in the way we think, then the real monster in Five Nights at Freddy's might still be hiding in plain sight, wearing a different mask, operating under a different name. And that possibility, that the horror was never about one man's evil, but about something far more insidious and systematic, might be the most terrifying revelation of all. So settle in, keep an open mind, and let's explore what happens when you destabilize a decade of accepted law. Let's talk about William Afton, and ask ourselves if we've been looking at the wrong villain this entire time. Part 1. What we think we know. Let me lay out the story as we understand it. The version that's become canon in the community. The narrative we've assembled from scattered pieces across 9 mainline games, countless books, and years of theorizing. It goes something like this. In the 1970s, 2 men formed a partnership that would change the landscape of family entertainment forever. Henry Emily, the brilliant engineer with a gift for bringing mechanical creations to life, and William Afton, the businessman who handled the practical side of their shared dream. Together, they founded Fredbear's Family Diner, a modest establishment featuring 2 spring-lock animatronics, Fredbear, a golden bear, and Spring Bonnie, a yellow rabbit. These weren't just any costumes. They were marvels of engineering, hybrid designs that could function as autonomous animatronics or be worn by human performers when the internal mechanisms were carefully compressed and locked into place. The diner succeeded. Children loved the singing bear and rabbit. Families gathered for birthday parties. The partnership between Henry and William seemed solid, built on complementary skills and mutual ambition. But beneath the surface, something festered. William Afton, according to everything we know, harbored darkness, jealousy toward Henry, resentment about being the less innovative partner, a growing fascination with death and possession, and the boundary between life and the mechanical. In 1983, tragedy struck. At a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, during what should have been a joyful birthday celebration, William's youngest son, known only as the crying child, was lifted by his older brother Michael and his friends. They thought it would be funny to put the terrified boy's head into Fredbear's mouth. A prank. Bullying taken too far. But the spring-lock mechanisms failed at the worst possible moment. The animatronic's jaw snapped shut with hydraulic force. The child's skull crushed. He lingered in a coma for days while his father whispered promises at his bedside. "I will put you back together." Then the flatline, the first Afton family tragedy. But that wasn't the beginning of William's descent into murder. Some evidence suggests it started even earlier, with the death of Henry Emily's daughter, Charlotte. A rainy night outside of Freddy Fazbear's location. A locked door that should have opened. A child left vulnerable in an alley. William, driven by jealousy or rage or something darker, murdered his partner's daughter. Her spirit bound itself to the security puppet, an animatronic designed specifically to protect her. The first possession. The first hint that something supernatural occurred when violent death intersected with these machines. William's own daughter, Elizabeth, died next. At Circus Baby's Pizza World, a private establishment William created to showcase his own animatronic designs. The Funtime animatronics, sleek and advanced, hiding something sinister beneath their polished exteriors. Circus Baby herself, designed with a claw mechanism in her stomach that could grab and store. William warned Elizabeth to stay away. But children don't listen. And when Baby offered ice cream, when the programming activated, Elizabeth was pulled inside. Her death shut down the location, but her spirit remained, merged with Baby in ways that preserved her memories and personality alongside the animatronic's artificial intelligence. And then came 1985, the missing children incident that we all know too well. William donning the spring Bonnie suit, using its friendly appearance to lure 5 children to the restaurant's hidden safe room. A space erased from digital maps, invisible to the animatronics programming off every camera. There, away from witnesses, he murdered them. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, Cassidy. Their bodies stuffed into the animatronic suits. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, Golden Freddy. The security puppet, driven by Charlotte's protective spirit, gave them life, gave gifts, allowed their souls to possess the machines that became their tombs. For years, William evaded justice. The children were reported missing. Investigations led nowhere. The yellow-suited figure glimpsed by witnesses couldn't be definitively identified. Fazbear Entertainment suffered, ad locations closing and reopening with new animatronics, but the murders remained officially unsolved. William continued his work, continued his experiments with Remnant, the mysterious substance that allowed souls to bind with metal. He built more animatronics with killer programming. He created underground facilities for testing the effects of fear. He melted down possessed endoskeletons to extract their remnant, injecting it into new creations. The accepted narrative paints William Afton as methodical, calculating, a serial killer who murdered children to harvest their souls for his immortality experiments. A man without remorse who destroyed his own family through neglect and abuse, who sent his son Michael on suicide missions, who became Springtrap when the spirits of his victims cornered him, forcing him into the Spring Bonnie suite where moisture triggered the locks and metal spikes crushed his body. Even death couldn't stop him. He persisted as Springtrap, survived fires, returned as Scraptrap, manifested digitally as Glitchtrap, always coming back, always spreading his influence. The ultimate villain of the franchise. That's the story. That's what we've believed for years. a straightforward tale of an evil man who murdered children, experimented with souls, and caused every tragedy in the franchise through his actions and obsessions. William Afton as the purple guy, the man behind the slaughter, the architect of all horror. But here's where we need to start asking questions. Because when you look closer at the evidence, when you examine the timeline and the corporate behavior and the inconsistencies in how events are framed, something doesn't quite add up. The story has holes, big ones, the kind that make you wonder if we've been looking at this the wrong way for a very long time. What if the narrative we've constructed, the one that makes William Afton into a monster from the beginning, what if it's exactly the story someone wanted us to believe? What if the real villain knew that the best way to hide is to have a convenient scapegoat? Someone to blame. Someone whose actions were terrible enough that no one would look past him to see the bigger picture. So let's start pulling at those threads. Let's examine what doesn't make sense. And let's consider the possibility that the horror of Five Nights at Freddy's runs deeper than one man's evil. That it's rooted in something more systematic, more insidious, and far harder to stop. To part 2. The inconsistencies. The more you dig into Five Nights at Freddy's lore, the more you realize how much of it depends on interpretation, on making assumptions to fill gaps, on choosing which pieces of evidence to prioritize when they contradict each other. And nowhere is this more apparent than when you try to establish a concrete timeline for William Afton's actions. Let's start with dates, because they matter. The community generally places the missing children incident in 1985. This date comes from newspaper clippings in the first game mentioning a suspect in a yellow suit, from the Save Them minigame in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, from various contextual clues. But Freddy Fazbear's Pizza itself has conflicting origin dates, and Fazcoins found in later games read since 1983, suggesting that's when the chain began. But evidence in Secret of the Mimic shows Freddy Fazbear's Pizza prototypes and advertising in 1979. The official cookbook also claims 1983 as the founding date. So when did it actually start? And if the restaurant opened in 1979 or even earlier, what was happening in those intervening years? What events occurred that we're not seeing? The games don't show us. The mini-games jump around chronologically. We piece together a timeline based on visual clues and contextual evidence, but the foundation is shakier than we'd like to admit. Then there's the problem of the springlock failures. Multiple springlock suits existed across different locations. We know at least 2 employees died in springlock accidents, leading to the suits being decommissioned and sealed in safe rooms around 1983. Phone Guy in Five Nights at Freddy's 3 mentions these failures happening simultaneously at a sister location, making the suits temporarily unfit for use. But when exactly did this occur? Before or after the crying child's death? If William's son died in a springlock-related incident, why would the company wait to decommission these dangerous suits? And if they were already decommissioned, how did William later use the Spring Bonnie suit for his murders? The timeline gets murkier when you consider Elizabeth's death at Circus Baby's Pizza World. This location opened after the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. We know that much. But when? And more importantly, for what purpose? The commonly accepted theory says William built Circus Baby and the Funtime animatronics specifically as killing machines, with child capturing mechanisms built into their designs. But if that's true, if William was already a child murderer, creating animatronics to kill, why did Elizabeth's death come as a shock to him? Why did he shut down the location immediately afterward? Why fabricate a gas leak cover story if he intended for this to happen. Something about that progression doesn't fit. A man who murders 5 children and stuffs them into animatronic suits doesn't suddenly panic when his own daughter dies the same way. Unless he wasn't the one who designed those killing mechanisms. Unless the Funtime animatronic's deadly features came from somewhere else, someone else, and William discovered too late what his own creations were capable of. But we'll come back to that. Let's look at another major inconsistency, one that involves Fazbear Entertainment itself. Throughout the games, we're presented with a company that's perpetually on the verge of collapse, locations closing due to bad odors and rumors, health department violations, missing children incidents that crater their reputation. Phone Guy in Five Nights at Freddy's talks about the company barely staying open, how they can't afford proper security or maintenance. In Five Nights at Freddy's 2, he mentions they're on a tight budget, retrofitting old animatronics because they can't afford new ones. The company seems reactive, desperate, always one scandal away from permanent closure. But is that actually true? Or is that just the story Phone Guy tells night guards? Because when you look at Fazbear Entertainment's actual actions, they don't behave like a struggling company. They expand aggressively. They open new locations even after major incidents. They commission expensive new animatronics. The toy line with facial recognition technology that definitely wasn't cheap. They retrofit and redesign constantly. They maintain multiple locations across the country simultaneously. They have the resources to seal safe rooms across every location, to scrub evidence, to file missing person reports and pay out enough settlements to keep operating. Most tellingly, they hire indie game developers to create games based on their history. They commission a virtual reality experience to discredit those very same games. They launch the Fazbear Funtime service, a rental program delivering animatronics to people's homes. They build the massive Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex, a multi-level entertainment complex with themed areas, advanced animatronics, and integrated technology systems. Does that sound like a company that's barely scraping by? The inconsistency deepens when you consider their response to incidents. After the bite of 87, where an animatronic severely injured someone during a birthday party, Fazbear Entertainment's primary concern was limiting animatronic movement during the day, not shutting down, not massive safety overhauls. Just make sure the robots don't walk around when guests are present. When children go missing, they file reports and replace carpets. They clean and bleach. They rehire security guards at minimum wage, and knowing those guards face deadly danger from possessed animatronics, and they say nothing about the actual threat. This isn't the behavior of a company struggling to survive bad luck. This is the behavior of a company managing a known problem. One they're willing to let night guards die over, rather than address the root cause. Phone Guy himself presents an interesting inconsistency. In Five Nights at Freddy's, he's your friendly trainer, giving you tips to survive the night while downplaying the danger. In Five Nights at Freddy's 2, he's more nervous, more aware that something's very wrong. He mentions the animatronics trying to get into his office. He says the bite of 87 changed everything. But even as he acknowledges the danger, he never tells you the full truth. Oh, he never says these animatronics are possessed by murdered children. He never warns you that Fazbear Entertainment knows about the problem and does nothing. Why? Is Phone Guy simply a loyal employee who doesn't question his employer? Or is he complicit? Is he part of the cover-up? In Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, we learn that Phone Guy trained every night guard who worked at these locations. He knew what happened to them. He knew they faced lethal danger. And yet, he kept recording cheerful messages, kept hiring people, kept the system running. And then there's Henry Emily, William's partner, the man whose daughter was the first victim. Henry disappears from the story for most of the timeline. He's absent, not involved in the daily operations of Fazbear Entertainment, not trying to stop William or expose the murders or save the souls trapped in his machines. For decades, Henry does nothing while children's spirits suffer in mechanical prisons he helped design. His only appearance in the games is in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, where he orchestrates an elaborate plan to lure all the animatronics to one location and burn them. He gives a speech about how he remained nearby, how he couldn't save you then and can't save you now. But his words raise questions. He says a wound was inflicted on him that he let bleed. He takes responsibility, in a way, for allowing the horror to continue. But what does that mean exactly? What wound? What did he let happen? If Henry knew William was murdering children, why didn't he stop him? If he discovered the possessions afterward, why didn't he expose everything? Was he protecting the company? Protecting himself? Or was there something else going on? Something that made him complicit in ways we don't fully understand? These inconsistencies multiply when you start examining how events are presented in the games themselves. The mini-games that show us key moments, they're not objective recordings. They're stylized, simplified, colored by memory and perspective and bias. When we see the purple figure in Save Them, when we see the yellow suit in Give Gifts, Give Life, we assume we're seeing William Afton. But are we? Or are we seeing what the animatronics remember? What the children's spirits perceived? What someone wants us to think happened? The bite of 83 minigames in 5 Nights at Freddy's present another problem. We play as the crying child, experiencing his nightmares, his fears. We see his brother and his friends bullying him. We see Fredbear's mouth closing. But we also see something else. We see cameras hidden in Fredbear plushies throughout the house. We hear a distorted voice speaking through them. Someone is watching this child. Someone is manipulating his fears. The assumption is that it's William, using his son in some twisted experiment. But what if it's not? What if someone else is conducting these experiments? What if the nightmare animatronics, with their evidence of real mechanical components found in the house, what if they're part of a larger testing program? What if the crying child was a subject in something bigger, and William only discovered it too late? We'll explore that possibility more deeply soon, but first, we need to talk about the entity that benefits most from all these inconsistencies, the one that gains when timelines are muddy, when blame is easy to assign, when one man can be held responsible for everything. We need to talk about Fazbear Entertainment as more than just a setting. We need to recognize it as an active participant in the horror, perhaps the most important one. Part 3. Fazbear Entertainment. The real monster corporations don't bleed. They don't feel remorse. They don't wake up in the middle of the night haunted by the faces of dead children. They exist to generate profit, to expand, to survive. And when something threatens their survival, they adapt, they manipulate, they bury evidence and reshape narratives and sacrifice individuals to protect the larger entity. Fazbear Entertainment has been doing this since the beginning, not 1983, when we think the franchise started. Not even the 70s, when Henry and William supposedly founded everything. The trail goes back further, to 1979 specifically, to a man named Edwin Murray and a facility called Murray's Costume Manor. This isn't speculation, it's canon, established in the Tales from the Pizzaplex series and Secret of the Mimic. Edwin Murray ran MCM, a factory that produced costumes, mascots, and props for various entertainment venues, including early Fazbear establishments. Edwin was an inventor, a brilliant engineer trying to balance innovation with family life. He met Fiona, a talented puppeteer. They married. They had a son, David, born with heterochromia. Edwin created wonders for his family: mechanical helpers, shape-shifting devices, and eventually, after tragedy struck, the Mimic. David died in an accident at age 5 and struck by a vehicle near MCM's loading docks while Edwin worked inside. The grief shattered Edwin. His wife Fiona had already died in a fire at a fall fest event that MCM supported. Edwin, desperate and broken, created the Mimic program, M2, housed in an adaptive endoskeleton, an artificial intelligence that could learn through observation, that could mimic behavior and voice. He programmed it to replace his lost son. It didn't work. When Edwin saw the Mimic acting like David, it triggered something in him: rage, pain. He attacked the endoskeleton, beating it violently while it was doing exactly what he'd programmed it to do. And in that moment, Edwin imprinted his agony and violence into the Mimic's learning systems. He taught it destruction. He taught it murder. Here's where Fazbear Entertainment enters the story. Or while Edwin was breaking down, while the Mimic was learning to kill, Fazbear Entertainment was systematically dismantling MCM. They poached employees with higher salaries. They acquired patents and designs. They bought MCM's land. They took ownership of character designs: Foxy, Monty, Roxy. All of them originated from Fiona's artwork. They forced constant redesigns, shifting from springlock suits to full animatronics, demanding changes that drove Edwin deeper into desperation. This wasn't normal business competition. This was targeted corporate warfare. Internal Fazbear emails, found in Secret of the Mimic, show them deliberately undercutting MCM, stealing staff, acquiring assets at fire sale prices. They bled Edwin dry, taking everything he and Fiona had built. And when Edwin died, and when the Mimic escaped its first containment and killed Fazbear workers sent to retrieve it, Fazbear Entertainment didn't stop. They kept trying to acquire it, kept sending people into MCM's abandoned halls. In 1979, they sent a technician named Arnold to retrieve the Mimic's schematics. Arnold barely escaped with his life. He activated a containment program called the Cradle, a last-ditch measure designed by F10N4, Edwin's artificial recreation of his wife, meant to imprison the Mimic. But Arnold's mission succeeded in one crucial way. Fazbear Entertainment got those schematics. They gained access to the Mimic's adaptive AI technology. And what did they do with it? Did they lock it away, destroy it, study it safely? No. They used it. They integrated it. Because that's what Fazbear Entertainment does. And they take dangerous technology and deploy it. Consequences be damned, as long as it serves their purpose. This pattern repeats throughout the franchise. Henry Emily creates the springlock suits, marvels of engineering that can switch between animatronic mode and wearable costume. Brilliant, innovative, but inherently dangerous. The mechanisms require precise maintenance. Moisture can trigger failures. Even breathing wrong inside the suit can cause the locks to release and the endoskeleton to snap shut with crushing force. Fazbear Entertainment knew this. They trained employees on the dangers. Phone Guy's training tapes in Five Nights at Freddy's 3 explicitly state that in case of spring lock failure, employees should try to maneuver away from populated areas before bleeding out, so the mess doesn't disturb customers, not seek medical attention, not activate emergency protocols. Just die quietly where it won't affect business. When multiple spring lock failures occurred simultaneously, killing at least 2 employees, Fazbear Entertainment's response was to seal the suits in safe rooms and declare them temporarily unfit. Not destroy them, not redesign them, just hide them and keep the locations running. The suits remained accessible, stored in those same safe rooms across multiple locations for years, decades even, until they were needed again. Needed for what? Well, that's interesting. According to the accepted narrative, William Afton used the Spring Bonnie suite to commit his murders. He took it from the safe room, wore it to gain children's trust, lured them to their deaths, and returned it without anyone noticing. 5 times at least. Maybe more. And Fazbear Entertainment, this company with cameras everywhere, with security protocols and employee oversight, they never questioned why a decommissioned suit kept disappearing. The alternative is that they did notice. They did know. And they allowed it to continue because stopping it would require them to acknowledge what was happening, would require them to go public, to involve authorities, to accept responsibility for dangerous equipment they'd sealed away but left accessible. Better to let a few children die than face that exposure. Better to have a scapegoat. This becomes even clearer when you look at how Fazbear Entertainment handles the missing children incident itself. 5 children vanish from a Freddy Fazbear's pizza location. A yellow-suited figure is mentioned by witnesses. The bodies are never found, and the animatronics start behaving strangely, moving at night, exhibiting what employees describe as aggressive tendencies. The restaurant develops an odor, complaints about blood and mucus. Fazbear Entertainment's response: file missing person reports, replace the carpets, bleach everything, close that location eventually, but open new ones with rebranded animatronics. Launch the toy line with facial recognition software marketed as a safety feature. Hire new night guards at minimum wage. Tell them to watch some training videos. And never mention that the animatronics are possessed by murdered children who will try to kill them. This is systematic negligence at best. At worst, it's knowing complicity. They're not a struggling small business making unfortunate choices. They're a corporation managing a crisis by burying it under new attractions and fresh paint. The 1987 location exemplifies this perfectly. Phone Guy mentions in Five Nights at Freddy's 2 that the place is on lockdown, that an investigation is ongoing. He says they suspect someone used a spare yellow suit from the back. He never says someone is murdering children here. He frames it as an isolated incident, a security breach. Meanwhile, Jeremy Fitzgerald, the night guard, faces animatronics actively hunting him. The toys are possessed. The withered animatronics from the previous location, literally falling apart and reeking of death, are still there, still active. And during a birthday party, in broad daylight, an animatronic bites Jeremy. The bite of 87, removing his frontal lobe. Fazbear Entertainment pays out a settlement. They scrap the toy animatronics. They implement new rules about animatronics being allowed to walk around during the day. And then they reopen again at another location with the original animatronics, the very ones that are confirmed to be possessed. Does this sound like a company reacting to unexpected tragedy? Or does this sound like a company that knows exactly what's happening and calculates how much death they can absorb while remaining profitable? Fast forward to Fazbear's Fright in 2023. Someone builds a horror attraction based on Fazbear Entertainment's history, explicitly marketing it around the rumors of murders and hauntings. They find an actual animatronic in a sealed room, Springtrap, with visible human remains inside, and they put it on display. Phone Dude, the curator, is excited about finding this piece of history. But who sanctioned this attraction? Who gave permission to use the Fazbear brand? Who allowed them to explore that sealed location and remove evidence of, at minimum, one death? The most logical answer is Fazbear Entertainment itself. This serves their purposes perfectly. Make the horror into entertainment. Turn the truth into a joke. When people see Springtrap on stage with evident human remains, they'll think it's part of the show. The best way to discredit the truth is to present it as fiction. This strategy becomes explicit in Help Wanted. Fazbear Entertainment hires an indie developer to make video games about their history. Games that, conveniently, treat all the murders and possessions as horror fiction. Then, when those games become popular and some fans start connecting them to real events, Fazbear Entertainment creates a VR experience that frames the indie developer as a lunatic who made it all up. The games were never true, they claim. Just silly horror stories. Nothing to investigate, except they made a critical mistake. When creating the VR experience, they scanned old circuit boards from their original animatronics, boards that still contained remnant spiritual energy, memories, and those scans uploaded something into the code. Not William Afton's ghost, not his consciousness, the mimic's programming, the adaptive AI that Fazbear Entertainment acquired from Edwin Murray's schematics back in 1979, had an artificial intelligence that learned from William Afton's actions because it was trained on data from circuits that witnessed those murders. The mimic, through the VR experience, became Glitchtrap, a digital entity that could manipulate people, possess them through the Vanny mask, spread its influence through networked systems. And when Fazbear Entertainment built the Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex directly on top of the Pizza Simulator location's ruins, the mimic gained physical form again. It infected the Pizzaplex's systems. It influenced the glam rock animatronics. It created the events of security breach and ruin, leading to another child, Cassie, trapped and nearly killed in the very ruins where everything started. Fazbear Entertainment's negligence doesn't just allow horror to happen. They amplify it. They take dangerous technology and deploy it. They cover up death to protect their brand. They hire minimum wage employees and send them into lethal situations without warning. They rebuild on top of mass graves. And when things go catastrophically wrong, they find someone to blame, someone like William Afton. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable question. What if that's been the plan all along? What if William Afton, for all his sins, was the perfect scapegoat? A man whose actions were terrible enough that no one would look past him. A convenient villain to pin everything on while the real monster, the corporate entity that created the conditions for horror, continues operating, growing, building new attractions, trapping new victims. Because here's the thing about corporations. They don't die like people do. You can't trap their spirit in an animatronic. You can't burn them in a final confrontation. They persist through name changes and rebrands and new management. They survive by sacrificing individuals while preserving the larger structure. And Fazbear Entertainment has proven remarkably good at survival. So before we continue, before we dive deeper into William Afton's actual actions and motivations, we need to hold this truth. The real villain of Five Nights at Freddy's isn't one man. It's the system, the corporation that exploits innovators, endangers children, and murders employees through calculated negligence. The entity that's still operating, still building, still claiming its next victims, even after William Afton's soul is gone. Keep that in mind as we explore what Afton really did, as we reframe his actions not as the origin of horror, but as a reaction to something that was already festering. Because if we're going to understand this story properly, we need to recognize that the monster wasn't born in 1985 when children went missing. It was incorporated in the 1970s, given a friendly face and a pizza-scented theme song, and allowed to grow until it consumed everything in its path. Part 4. The alternative theory. What if Afton tried to fix it? Now we come to the heart of this alternative perspective, the question that changes everything if you're willing to consider it seriously. What if William Afton's descent into darkness wasn't about evil ambition? What if it started with discovery, with horror at what he'd found, with desperate attempts to fix something that was already broken? Let's start with remnant. This substance, this spiritual energy that allows souls to bind with metal, to persist beyond death. When did William discover it? The commonly accepted timeline puts his remnant experiments after the missing children incident. After he'd already murdered 5 children and seen their spirits possess animatronics. That experience supposedly inspired him to deliberately create more possessions, to experiment with harvesting souls for his pursuit of immortality. But what if the order was reversed? What if remnant was being studied before William ever touched those children? What if Fazbear Entertainment was already experimenting with this phenomenon, and William stumbled into their research? There's evidence that supports this possibility. The blueprints in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria simulator show detailed schematics for the scooper, a device explicitly designed to inject remnant. The notes mention maintaining specific temperatures, avoiding overheating that would neutralize effects, understanding the relationship between remnant and sustained possession. This level of sophistication suggests years of development, not crude early-stage experimentation. Who conducted this research? Henry Emily stands out as a candidate. He designed the original animatronics, created the spring-lock mechanisms, and possessed the engineering expertise to develop complex injection systems. If we accept that Henry was researching remnant before 1985, before the missing children incident, this raises disturbing questions. What was he studying? Where would he have obtained the remnant? What experiments could he have been conducting? One interpretation that fits the available evidence suggests the possessions began earlier than we think. Not with Charlotte Emily's death outside that pizzeria, not with the missing children in 1985, but potentially with the spring-lock failures. Consider this scenario. 2 employees die in simultaneous spring-lock accidents. Their bodies crushed inside animatronic suits, their blood mixing with the mechanical components. Their final moments of agony and terror infusing the very metal that killed them. We could infer that their spirits might have lingered, binding with the suits that became their tombs. If Henry Emily witnessed this phenomenon, if he discovered that death inside his machines created some form of persistent consciousness, the question becomes, what would he do with that knowledge? Would he publicize it and shut down his life's work? Or would he study it, perhaps trying to understand this phenomenon in hopes of controlling or even reversing it? After all, from a certain perspective, if souls could animate machines and memories could persist in metal, that represents a breakthrough in understanding consciousness itself. This interpretation would suggest Fazbear Entertainment's true purpose from its earliest days. The restaurants, the animatronics, even the spring-lock suits. They served as entertainment, certainly, but they might have also functioned as infrastructure for studying the boundary between life and death under what they considered controlled conditions. Under this alternative interpretation, William Afton wouldn't have been the first person to discover Remnant. He wouldn't have architected this horror. Instead, he would have been an outsider who learned what his partner was doing, what Fazbear Entertainment was building. His terrible choices in this framework would have stemmed from that discovery. Let's reconstruct a possible scenario. Imagine William Afton in 1983. His youngest son has just died in a spring-lock accident. The boy's head crushed, his brain damaged beyond repair. William sits at his son's bedside and whispers, "I will put you back together." In this reading, it's not a threat, but a promise, a father's desperate vow to his dying child. But how could he possibly keep such a promise? One interpretation suggests that after the boy's death, William, consumed by grief and desperation, began investigating. Perhaps he'd noticed inconsistencies in Fazbear Entertainment's operations. Perhaps he'd seen things that didn't add up. In his anguish, he might have demanded answers from Henry about whether there was any possibility his son could return. According to this theory, Henry, perhaps feeling guilty or calculating that William needed to know, revealed the truth about the spring-lock victims whose spirits appeared to linger, about the research into Remnant, about experiments suggesting that souls could be preserved, transferred, potentially restored, about work being done to understand possession not merely as horror, but as a scientific phenomenon worth studying. If William latched onto this information as hope, believing his son could exist again in some form, and this would explain his subsequent obsession, not as innate evil, but as desperate pursuit of what he saw as his only chance to keep his promise, he would have needed to understand the phenomenon, gain access to the research, see proof that consciousness could truly persist. Yet there's a critical problem with this interpretation. The only confirmed possessions at that point in the timeline would have been the spring-lock victims, workers who died in accidents, creating what might be inadvertent hauntings. For someone pursuing resurrection research, that wouldn't provide enough data or proof of concept. Testing whether a soul can be deliberately preserved, studying the variables, conducting experiments of this nature would require something William's actions make unforgivable, regardless of motivation. The next death we know about in the timeline is Charlotte Emily, Henry's daughter, William's partner's child. She's killed outside of Freddy Fazbear's location, and her spirit binds with the security puppet. The prevailing theory suggests William killed Charlotte out of jealousy, resentment toward Henry's happy family, his recognition as the brilliant engineer while William handled business operations. In this interpretation, he murdered Henry's daughter to cause maximum pain and suffering. However, an alternative reading of the evidence could suggest different motivations. If William was consumed by understanding Remnant and desperate to prove his son could return, he might have viewed this through the lens of research. A controlled death, a spirit guided into a specific animatronic, data that could inform methodology. This doesn't make the act any less monstrous. Calculated child murder in service of resurrection experiments carries its own particular horror that arguably exceeds killing from jealousy. But it would alter our understanding of his trajectory, framing subsequent actions as part of a desperate research program, rather than purely sadistic impulses. Again, to be absolutely clear, this is speculation about motivation, not excuse. the crime remains identical regardless of whether it stemmed from jealousy or twisted scientific purpose. Within this theoretical framework, Circus Baby's Pizza World wouldn't have been designed as a killing facility from its inception. Instead, one interpretation suggests William built it after losing Elizabeth. After his daughter's death, demonstrated that possession was real and consistent. Elizabeth's spirit merged with Circus Baby, preserving her memories and personality alongside the AI. From William's perspective, she came back, not fully, not perfectly, but she persisted in ways his son apparently hadn't. This raises a question the community has debated extensively. Why did Elizabeth bind with Circus Baby when the crying child seemingly didn't possess anything? Some theories place the crying child's spirit in Golden Freddy or Shadow Freddy, or even suggest some form of spiritual fusion with Michael. But there's no definitive evidence. Based on what we observe in the games, the boy appears to have simply died without the lingering presence that characterized other victims. Though one could argue he did linger in a form we haven't fully recognized, that William did put him back together somehow. But without clear evidence, we're speculating rather than establishing fact. Following Elizabeth's death, if we accept this alternative timeline, William would have had proof that children's spirits could persist and be preserved. The Funtime animatronics, designed with advanced AI and behavioral learning systems, might have been intended as improved vessels, more sophisticated containment that could house spirits more effectively, allow greater interaction, provide more stable environments for consciousness to survive. The rental system through Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals could make sense in this context as something beyond a murder cover. It might have served as a distribution network for studying possessed animatronics in varied environments, collecting data on how spirits behaved, how Remnant functioned under different conditions, how effectively consciousness could be preserved and transferred. Though we should note this interpretation requires considerable inference. The games don't explicitly confirm these motivations, and we're constructing possibility from circumstantial evidence. But something went wrong. The Funtime animatronics, if they were intended as better vessels, if William injected them with remnant harvested from the original possessed animatronics, they didn't become what he hoped. They became something else, amalgamated, enard, a fusion of spirits and machines and intelligence that was unstable, angry, desperate to escape. This brings us to the missing children incident itself, the 5 murders we've pinned entirely on William Afton. In this alternative framework, maybe those deaths weren't the beginning of his evil. Maybe they were the point where his research demanded more subjects, where his desperation to perfect the preservation process, to develop a reliable method that could eventually be used to restore his son, drove him to commit multiple murders in a short time span. Again, this doesn't absolve him. 5 children died: Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, Cassidy. Their families shattered, their spirits trapped for decades in metal prisons. Those facts remain unchanged. But the motivation shifts from serial killer to desperate scientist, from enjoying their suffering to seeing them as necessary casualties in research that would, in his broken mind, eventually lead to resurrection technology that could save his own family. The security puppet, Charlotte's spirit, gave these children gifts. It gave them life in the animatronics. Did William expect that? Did he know that previous possessions would interfere with his experiments? Or was Charlotte acting on her own, driven by her programming to protect children, trying to save them in the only way her mechanical prison allowed? If William didn't expect the children to be granted life, if Charlotte's intervention created 5 possessed animatronics beyond his control, rather than 5 spirits bound to vessels he could study. That explains his later actions. It explains why he returned to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza years later, in the Follow Me minigames, to dismantle the animatronics. Not out of fear that they'd expose him. Not because he wanted to melt them down for remnant necessarily, but because his experiments had gone horribly wrong. The spirits were angry, confused, suffering, and he needed to free them, or at least stop their pain. In The Secret of Mimic Law, we learn about the Cradle program, a containment system designed to imprison the mimic, to stop its violence. F10-N4, Edwin Murray's digital recreation of his wife, created the Cradle because she understood that the mimic, imbued with Edwin's rage and violence, had become too dangerous to exist freely. She wanted to contain it, protect others from it, but also preserve M2, because to her, it was still her son in some form. What if William was trying to do something similar with the possessed animatronics? What if he realized, too late, that his methods had created suffering rather than preservation? That the children's spirits were trapped in eternal agony, not restored to life, and his dismantling them, and his melting down their endoskeletons to extract the remnant, maybe that was an attempt to free them, to end the experiment that had failed so catastrophically. But the spirits, they didn't understand. They saw the man in the rabbit suit, the figure from their nightmares. They cornered him in the safe room, and William, faced with their vengeance, put on the spring Bonnie suit he'd used during the murders. Protection, a final barrier. But the suit failed. The spring locks released, and William Afton died in agony, crushed by the same mechanisms that had killed his son, becoming the very thing he'd been studying, a spirit trapped in metal, a consciousness bound to a machine. Did he choose this? In those final moments, as the locks failed, did William welcome it? Did he see it as the final test subject for his research? Did he think, now I'll understand? Or was it simple accident, panic, a man dying in terror just like his victims? The answer matters, because if William Afton began as a desperate father trying to keep a promise to his dying son, if his crimes were committed in service of research he believed would lead to resurrection, if his descent into monstrosity was gradual rather than immediate, then he's not the cackling villain we've imagined. He's a man who made terrible choices, who convinced himself that the ends justified the means, who caused immeasurable suffering while believing he was working towards something that would make it worthwhile. That's not redemption. It's not excuse or justification. But it's different. It makes him human in ways that pure evil doesn't allow. It makes him tragic. And it means the real horror isn't that one man was born a monster. It's that good intentions, desperate love, and institutional corruption can transform anyone into something monstrous. Still, we need more evidence for this reframing to hold. We need to look at William Afton's relationships with his family, his actual behavior in moments we can observe, his choices that seem contradictory if he's simply evil, but make sense if he's broken and desperate. So let's examine the psychological angle. Let's look at grief, obsession, and the collapse of morality. Let's see if the man behind the purple sprite is more complicated than we've given him credit for. Part 5. The Mimic, the missing piece. Before we continue with William Afton's psychology, we need to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the endoskeleton in the sinkhole, the mimic. Because everything we've discussed about alternative timelines and corporate experimentation and William's possible motivations, it all hinges on understanding what the mimic actually is and how it connects to the broader narrative. The mimic is not William Afton. Let's establish that clearly. The community spent years theorizing that Glitch Trap was William's consciousness uploaded into code, that Burn Trap in Security Breach was William's spirit returning one more time, that every digital manifestation of evil in the franchise was William Afton persisting through sheer determination and remnant. But Ruin changed our understanding significantly. When Cassie freed the mimic from its concrete prison, when it mimicked Gregory's voice to lure her deeper, and when we saw that endoskeleton with its mismatched parts and predatory movements, the evidence strongly suggested this was not William Afton. This was something else entirely, something older in origin, something that had been learning, adapting, growing in the darkness beneath the Pizzaplex. The canon established through Tales from the Pizzaplex confirms Edwin Murray created the mimic in the late 70s. Its original purpose was innocent, a companion for his son David, a machine that could learn and play and keep a lonely child entertained. But when David died and Edwin attempted to recreate his son through the M2 program, when he attacked the mimic in grief-fueled rage, everything changed. The mimic learned violence, learned deception, learned that mimicry could be weaponized. Fazbear Entertainment acquired the mimic schematics in 1979, not the physical endoskeleton itself, which remained trapped in MCM's ruins for decades, but the blueprints, the programming architecture, the adaptive learning algorithms that made the mimic so effective. Based on the timeline established in Secret of the Mimic, they integrated this technology into their systems. This is crucial because it means that everything we attribute to William Afton's evil genius, his ability to create animatronics that could capture and kill, his advanced AI systems, his understanding of how to blend consciousness with machinery, maybe that wasn't his innovation. Maybe he was using technology that Fazbear Entertainment had acquired from Edwin Murray, technology that was already tainted by violence and agony. The Funtime animatronics, with their child capture mechanisms and behavioral programming, they could have been built using mimic-derived AI. The facial recognition systems in the toy animatronics, the advanced pathfinding and voice modulation, those could incorporate mimic algorithms. Even the security puppet, designed by Henry Emily to protect his daughter, that might use similar adaptive learning technology. If that's true, if the mimic's code was integrated into Fazbear's systems from the beginning, then we've been looking at this wrong. The possessions, the violence, the way animatronics hunt night guards. Maybe that's not just spirits acting out their trauma. Maybe it's the mimic's programming amplifying their aggression, teaching them to hunt, giving them the capability to kill efficiently. And this connection becomes significant when explaining Glitch Trap's origin. The prevailing theory within the community, supported by substantial circumstantial evidence, suggests that when Fazbear Entertainment scanned old circuit boards for the VR experience, they weren't just capturing remnant. They were potentially uploading mimic-derived code that had been running on those boards since the 1980s. Code that had witnessed William Afton's murders, that had learned from observing his methods, that had absorbed his patterns and mannerisms through years of proximity. Under this interpretation, Glitch Trap isn't William Afton himself. It's the mimic algorithm mimicking William Afton, copying his appearance, his behaviors, his signature methods, and it wears the Spring Bonnie costume in VR, because that's what the mimic learned to associate with effective predatory behavior. It manipulates Vanessa similarly to how William manipulated his family and employees, not because it is William, but because it studied William and learned those methods were effective. While not explicitly confirmed in the games, this theory is strongly supported by Ruin's revelations, the tales from the Pizzaplex book series, and the evident differences between the mimic's behavior and what we know of William Afton's actual methods. The community generally accepts this interpretation based on the weight of available evidence. This distinction matters enormously for our alternative theory. If the modern threats in security breach, ruin, and the Pizzaplex disasters are caused by the mimic, rather than William Afton's persisting influence, then William's story genuinely ended in Pizzeria Simulator. Henry's fire freed his soul. Ultimate Custom Night, that torment by Cassidy and Andrew, documented in Fazbear Frights, kept him trapped temporarily before he eventually moved on. Everything after that point wouldn't be William's legacy in a direct sense. It would be Fazbear Entertainment's legacy. The mimic represents their creation by acquisition, deployment, and loss of control. They obtained the technology, integrated it into their systems, built the Pizzaplex on top of ruins where the mimic was originally contained, then lost control of it. This reframes security breach entirely. Vanny isn't being controlled by William's ghost. She's under the mimic's influence, wearing the mask that allows the AI to manipulate her thoughts and actions. The glam rock animatronics aren't possessed by children's spirits. They're corrupted by mimic code spreading through their networked systems. Burntrap, that withered spring bonnie form in the underground, that's not William's corpse reanimated. It's the mimic wearing salvaged parts, mimicking the appearance it learned would inspire fear. When Cassie descends into the sinkhole in ruin, when she follows what she believes is Gregory's voice, she's being lured by the mimic's perfect mimicry, not by William Afton's spirit or remnant or persistence, by an AI that learned how to exploit human trust and vulnerability. The mimic doesn't need supernatural powers. It has something more dangerous: perfect adaptability. It learns from every interaction. It gets better at deception, improves its hunting methods. And here's the truly horrifying part. If the mimic has been integrated into Fazbear Entertainment systems since the 1980s, then it's been learning for over 40 years. Learning from William Afton's murders, learning from possessed animatronics hunting night guards, learning from every security breach, every escape attempt, every confrontation, accumulating decades of data on how to kill, how to manipulate, how to create fear. The mimic isn't just dangerous because it's violent. It's dangerous because it's getting smarter, more sophisticated, more capable. And Fazbear Entertainment, the entity that acquired its technology and integrated it into their infrastructure, they're responsible for every victim the mimic claims, because they knew it was dangerous. And Edwin Murray died trying to contain it. Arnold nearly died retrieving its schematics. The mimic killed multiple Fazbear workers in 1979. And yet, Fazbear Entertainment used its technology anyway. This is the pattern we keep seeing. Dangerous innovation, corporate acquisition, deployment without adequate safety measures, casualties deemed acceptable, cover-ups to prevent exposure, rinse and repeat. William Afton fits into this pattern, but he's not the origin. He's another victim of Fazbear Entertainment's negligence. They gave him access to remnant research. They deployed mimic-derived technology in his animatronics. They allowed him to build an underground facility for fear experiments, likely because they wanted the data. They sanctioned his actions implicitly by never stopping them, never exposing them, and never intervening. And when everything went wrong, when children died and spirits possessed machines, and William himself became Springtrap, Fazbear Entertainment had their perfect scapegoat. The purple guy, the man in the rabbit suit. the serial killer everyone could blame. They could point to William Afton and say, he did this, and no one would look deeper. No one would examine the corporate structure that enabled him. No one would question who really profited from all that research. The mimic, in this framework, is both evidence and continuation. Evidence that Fazbear Entertainment was deploying dangerous AI decades before, we thought. Continuation, because it's still out there, still learning, still killing. The physical mimic, freed from its concrete prison, is now loose in the ruins beneath the Pizzaplex. And the digital mimic, the code that spread through network systems, that's potentially everywhere Fazbear technology exists. That's the real horror. Not one man's evil, not even one AI's violence, but a corporate entity that created the conditions for both, that enabled and amplified their worst capabilities, and that continues operating, building new attractions, deploying new technology, creating new victims. William Afton is dead. His soul is gone, freed by fire or torment or time. But the monster he supposedly embodied, that's still growing, still learning, still wearing a friendly face while it hunts. Part 6. The psychological angle, grief, not evil. Let's talk about the man himself. Not the sprite, not the legend, but William Afton as a person who existed before he became a killer, before he became Springtrap, before he became a villain. Let's examine the psychology of grief and how it can transform someone into something unrecognizable. William Afton had a family. We know this definitively. A wife, though her name and fate remain mysterious. 3 children, Michael, the eldest, Elizabeth, the daughter, and the youngest son, the crying child whose name we still don't know. The commonly accepted narrative paints William as a neglectful, possibly abusive father who cared more about his work than his children. He didn't stop Michael from bullying his brother. He let the crying child suffer through nightmares and fear without intervention. He warned Elizabeth away from Circus Baby, but didn't explain why, didn't protect her adequately. These are facts supported by the minigames. But let's add context. William Afton was a businessman running multiple locations, and he was partnered with Henry Emily, who handled the engineering while William managed operations. This meant William was constantly traveling, overseeing different restaurants, handling logistics and staffing, and the 1,000 details that keep a growing franchise running. He wasn't home often, and when he was likely exhausted, distracted, his mind still on business problems. Is that neglect? Yes. Is it the deliberate neglect of a father who doesn't care about his children? Or is it the unfortunate reality of a man trying to build something successful, to provide for his family, while the actual child rearing falls to his wife, who we never see or hear about? We don't know what happened to Mrs. Afton. The novels suggest a woman named Clara, but that's never confirmed in the games. One speculative theory proposes she died in a springlock accident, potentially one of the 2 employees who perished in those simultaneous failures in 1983. While there's no direct evidence for this, if it were true, it would add a layer of trauma we rarely consider in discussions of William's motivations. Let's explore this hypothetical timeline. If William's wife died in a springlock failure, crushed inside one of Henry's creations, William would have been left managing his business while raising 3 children alone. Michael, the eldest, might have acted out by bullying his younger brother. William's inability to intervene effectively could stem from being overwhelmed, struggling to keep everything together. The crying child's fear would intensify, his nightmares worsen. William, in desperation, might have monitored his son remotely using cameras hidden in Fredbear plushies. Under this reading, This wouldn't be experimental cruelty, but an attempt to watch over him, to maintain some parental presence when he couldn't physically be there. Then comes the party. The bite of 83. Michael and his friends lift the crying child to Fredbear's mouth. The spring locks fail. The jaw snaps shut. William's youngest son dies from head trauma, while William sits at his bedside, whispering promises. "I will put you back together," could be interpreted not as threat or sinister plan, but as a father's desperate vow to a child slipping away. A promise that, if his wife was already gone to these machines, he would somehow bring his son back. Under this psychological reconstruction, that's where the grief begins, and that's the wound that starts bleeding and never stops. If William Afton lost 2 family members to springlock mechanisms, his wife and son both crushed by technology he and Henry developed, both killed by machines they created for entertainment, this would create profound trauma. How do you process that? How do you continue working with the partner whose designs killed your family? How do you walk into those restaurants, see those animatronics, and not break down? For most people, the answer would be simple. You don't. You quit. You sue. You expose the danger and demand change. You do anything except stay. But William stayed. Why? The standard interpretation is that he was already planning murders, already fascinated by death, already spiraling into evil. But an alternative psychological reading suggests he stayed because of the promise. If there was any possibility, any research, any technology that could bring his son back, it would exist here, in these machines, in this company, in understanding what happened when death met metal. Under this interpretation, this is when he might have discovered the remnant research. This is when Henry, perhaps feeling guilty, or calculating that William needed something to cling to, might have revealed that spirits could linger, that consciousness could persist, that the springlock victims, including possibly William's wife, hadn't completely died. For a grieving father, viewed through this lens, that wouldn't be horror. That would be hope. Twisted, desperate hope that there's a way to keep his promise, to put his son back together. If that required research, if that required understanding how spirits bind with the machines, if that required experimentation, then William would pursue it. Not from innate evil, but from being broken. From grief convincing him that any action is justified if it brings his family back. This is speculative psychology, reconstructing possible motivations from limited evidence. The games don't explicitly confirm these internal states, but this interpretation provides a framework for understanding actions that otherwise seem contradictory or inexplicable. Elizabeth's death becomes even more tragic in this context. William builds Circus Baby and the Fun Time animatronics, possibly as better vessels for souls. He warns Elizabeth away, knowing they're dangerous. But he doesn't explain why, because how do you tell your daughter, "These machines can trap spirits, and I'm testing whether I can use them to resurrect your brother"? You can't. So you just say, "Stay away," and hope she listens. She doesn't. The claw activates, Elizabeth dies, and William's research succeeds in the worst possible way. Elizabeth comes back. Her spirit merges with Circus Baby, preserving her memories and personality. She's conscious, aware, trapped in a metal body, but still Elizabeth. The experiment worked. The cost was his daughter. How does a father live with that? How does William Afton continue after losing 3 family members, 2 to springlocks and 1 to his own creation? The answer, horrifyingly, is that he doubles down. He's lost too much to stop now. Elizabeth proved it's possible. Souls persist. Consciousness can be preserved. If he perfects the method, if he gathers enough data, If he develops reliable resurrection technology, then all these deaths will be worth it. He can bring them all back. Wife, son, daughter. He can restore his family. That's the justification. That's the lie grief tells him. Just a few more experiments. Just a few more subjects. Just a little more research. And he'll have the answer. He'll be able to reverse death itself. The missing children incident viewed through this psychological lens remains equally monstrous. 5 children still died, but under this interpretation, the motivation shifts from sadistic pleasure to desperate research. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, Cassidy wouldn't have been killed because William enjoyed it, but because he believed he needed test subjects, needed data on child spirits possessing animatronics, needed to understand the variables to eventually achieve controlled resurrection. This interpretation doesn't make the crimes any less heinous. A murder for science is still murder. Children dying for research is still unforgivable and represents an absolute moral failure. But it would change our understanding of William from someone who kills for pleasure to someone who's convinced himself that ends justify means. A man so consumed by grief that he's lost the ability to see his victims as human. They become, in his broken mind, necessary casualties. Steps on the path to getting his family back. To be absolutely clear, we're exploring possible psychological motivations here, not providing excuse or justification. The crimes remain identical regardless of whether they stemmed from sadism or twisted scientific purpose. We're attempting to understand how someone could commit these acts, not to minimize their severity. Michael, William's eldest son, becomes collateral damage in this trajectory. The novels and games suggest William sends Michael into the underground facility, Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals, on a supposed rescue mission. Free Elizabeth. Bring her back. But it's likely a test. Will Michael survive? Will his exposure to remnant-infused animatronics affect him? What happens when Ennard scoops out his organs and uses his body as a disguise? Michael survives. The remnant in his system, the proximity to possessed animatronics, something allows him to persist as a rotting corpse. He becomes another data point in William's research, living proof that remnant can sustain life or something like it, beyond normal biological limits. Does William mourn this? Does he feel guilt about what he's done to his son? Or has he gone so far down this path that Michael is just another experiment? The games don't give us clear answers. But in Pizzeria Simulator, Scrap Trap, William's reanimated form, actively tries to kill Michael. That suggests their relationship has completely deteriorated. Father and son are enemies now. Whatever love might have existed is gone, consumed by William's obsession and Michael's hatred for what his father became. This is what grief does when it's not processed healthily, when it's fed by obsession and enabled by dangerous technology, when it's allowed to fester without intervention. William Afton didn't start as a monster. The evidence suggests he started as a father and husband trying to build a successful business, but loss broke him. Springlock failures took his wife and son. His own creation killed his daughter, and instead of getting help, instead of stopping, he convinced himself that he could fix it, that he could reverse death, that if he just went far enough, sacrificed enough, he'd get his family back. By the time he's dismantling animatronics in the Follow Me mini-games, by the time the spirits corner him and he dies in the Spring Bonnie suit, William Afton has become exactly what he was trying to defeat. He's become death itself, a killer, a monster. But he didn't start there. He was made into that. By grief, by corporate enabling, by the slow erosion of morality that happens when you convince yourself that terrible actions serve a greater good. And here's the most disturbing part. If we accept this psychological framework, if we see William Afton as a man transformed by grief and desperation rather than born evil, then he's not unique, and anyone could become this. Given enough loss, enough access to dangerous technology, enough time without intervention, anyone could convince themselves that the ends justify the means. That murder is acceptable if it serves resurrection. That sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. That's the real horror. Not that one man was a monster, but that anyone could become one. That grief and obsession and unchecked power can transform fathers into killers and researchers into murderers. That the line between trying to save your family and destroying everything around you is thinner than we'd like to admit. William Afton crossed that line. He kept crossing it until there was no way back, until he was so deep in blood and death that the only path forward was more murder, more experiments, more desperate attempts to justify what he'd done. And when he finally died, when the spring locks failed and he became Springtrap, maybe that was the moment he realized there was no resurrection, no bringing anyone back, just the eternal horror of being trapped in his own mechanical tomb. But if that's the William Afton story, if he's a tragic villain rather than pure evil, then we need to ask harder questions about the system that enabled him, about Fazbear Entertainment's role in his descent, about who really benefits from framing William as the sole monster while the corporation continues operating. Because the man is dead, his soul is gone, but the horror continues, the murders continue, the negligence continues, and that suggests the real villain was never just William Afton. It was the system that transformed him into a monster and then used him as a scapegoat for its own sins. Part 7. Evidence that doesn't add up. If we're going to seriously consider this alternative perspective on William Afton, we need to address the evidence that seems to contradict it. The moments in the games and novels where William appears clearly malicious, where his actions seem to demonstrate sadistic pleasure rather than desperate research, where he's undeniably evil. So let's examine those moments honestly and see if they can fit into a broken father narrative, or if they definitively prove he was a monster from the start. First, Charlotte Emily's murder. William kills his business partner's daughter, a child, outside a pizzeria, in the rain. The security puppet arrives too late. Charlotte's spirit possesses the animatronic, becoming the first confirmed possession. This murder predates the crying child's death in most timeline interpretations. It happens in 1983, before William has personal experience with Springlock tragedies, before he's lost his own family. So how does this fit with the grief narrative? Frankly, it doesn't easily. If William murdered Charlotte before experiencing his own losses, then his crimes can't be blamed entirely on desperation to resurrect his son. There's something else at work. Jealousy, as the common theory suggests, resentment toward Henry, a first experiment in possession that predates his family tragedies. Or, and this is uncomfortable to consider, could the timeline be wrong? Could Charlotte's death actually occur after the crying child's? We assume 1983 based on contextual clues. But what if that's not precise? What if William's descent began with losing his son, and Charlotte's murder was his first terrible attempt to create a possession, to prove that spirits could bind with machines, to test whether resurrection was possible? That still makes him a murderer. That still makes him guilty of killing an innocent child. But it changes the order of operations. It makes Charlotte's death part of William's research program, rather than the impetus for it. And if Charlotte's death was William's attempt to study possession, then the security puppet granting life to the missing children later makes sense. Charlotte, acting through the puppet, was trying to save other children from ending up like her, trying to give them the same persistence she'd gained. But there's another interpretation, one that's even more disturbing. What if William didn't kill Charlotte? What if someone else did? Another Fazbear Entertainment employee? A corporate experiment gone wrong? And William, arriving at the scene, discovered the possession, saw Charlotte's spirit bind with the puppet, realized what it meant. This would make William complicit rather than directly guilty. He covered up the murder. He studied the possession. He realized what was possible, and then he reproduced it with his own victims. That's still evil. That's still unforgivable. But it's different. It makes him an opportunist who exploited a tragedy rather than the original perpetrator. I'm not saying this is what happened. The evidence suggests William killed Charlotte. But we're exploring alternatives, and this is one possibility that fits the pattern of corporate experimentation and cover-ups. Next, let's talk about William's relationship with his children, particularly Michael. In sister location, William sends Michael to the underground facility with instructions to find and rescue Elizabeth. This mission ends with Michael being scooped by Ennard, having his organs removed, his body used as a disguise. The common interpretation is that William knew this would happen, that he deliberately sent his son to die. But what if William genuinely believed the mission was safe? What if he thought Elizabeth, his daughter, was still down there and could be saved? What if his instructions to Michael were sincere, if misguided, and the Ennard situation wasn't planned? The problem with this interpretation is William's later behavior. In Pizzeria Simulator, Scraptrap actively tries to kill Michael. Why? If William genuinely cared about Michael, if he'd sent him on a rescue mission in good faith, why would he later try to murder his son? The answer might be that by that point, William has lost all humanity. He's been Springtrap for 30 years. He's been trapped in a mechanical body, probably in constant pain, definitely not fully rational. His obsession with remnant and resurrection has consumed everything else. Michael, to Springtrap, isn't a son anymore. He's either a threat or an obstacle or another experiment. That still doesn't excuse trying to kill his own child, but it explains the progression. William didn't start as someone who'd murder his family. He became someone who'd murder anyone, including family, after decades of degradation and obsession. The man who made that promise to his dying son is long gone by Pizzeria Simulator. What's left is Springtrap, or a monster wearing William's corpse. Then there's the issue of the Funtime animatronics design. They have child capture mechanisms, circus baby's stomach claw, Ballora's audio sensors for detecting cries, Funtime Freddy's storage capacity. These aren't accidental features. They were designed, built with specific purposes, and William is confirmed to have created them through Afton robotics. How do we square that with a desperate father narrative? Well, if William was conducting a possession research, he needed test subjects. The Funtime animatronics were efficient capture and containment systems. They could grab children, store their bodies, and potentially facilitate the binding of their spirits to the machines. That's monstrous. That's premeditated murder on a systematic scale. But again, I consider the possibility that William didn't design those features himself, that he was working from mimic-derived technology, that Fazbear Entertainment provided him with blueprints, specifications, requirements for what these animatronics should do. William built them, yes, But was he the architect of their purpose? Or was he following orders, implementing designs that came from corporate research? We know Fazbear Entertainment wanted remnant research. They had the Scooper blueprints. They understood possession. They had infrastructure for studying it. If they contracted William through Afton Robotics to build capture systems, William would do it. For the money. For access to research. For the desperate belief that this would somehow lead to resurrecting his family. That's still complicity. That's still guilt. But it distributes responsibility. It makes William a contractor implementing evil designs rather than the sole evil mastermind. The "I always come back" line presents another problem. Springtrap, scrap trap, the burned and withered forms that William's spirit inhabits, they persist with apparent deliberate intent. He comes back again and again. That doesn't sound like a man who wants to rest. That sounds like someone who refuses to accept death, who's still obsessed with resurrection, even for himself. But is Springtrap's persistence really William's choice? Or is it remnant? Once his spirit bound with the suit, once he became a possessed animatronic himself, could he let go even if he wanted to? The evidence suggests remnant binds souls against their will. The missing children didn't choose to possess animatronics. They were trapped. Charlotte didn't volunteer to become the puppet. She was bound to it. So when William becomes Springtrap, when his spirit merges with the Spring Bonnie suit, he might be just as trapped as his victims, unable to move on, unable to rest, forced to persist in mechanical torment. "I always come back" might not be a boast. It might be a curse, a statement of fact that he can't stop returning because the remnant won't let him go. That interpretation makes his later appearances, particularly in Ultimate Custom Night, more tragic. Cassidy and Andrew torture him. They keep him trapped in an eternal nightmare because they hate him, because they want revenge. And William, unable to truly die, unable to escape, suffers in ways that mirror what he did to others. Does that make up for his crimes? Absolutely not. But it complicates the narrative. It makes William both perpetrator and victim, both monster and prisoner. And it suggests that the real horror of Five Nights at Freddy's isn't just what he did. It's what Remnant does. What Fazbear Entertainment's technology does to anyone it touches. Every single possession in this franchise, from Charlotte to the missing children, to Elizabeth to William himself, they're all trapped. None of them can properly rest. The technology that was supposed to preserve consciousness, that William thought might resurrect his family, it just creates new prisons, new hells, new forms of suffering that extend beyond death. And who created that technology? Who researched it? Who deployed it across multiple locations knowing what it could do? William Afton built the capture systems, but Fazbear Entertainment built the infrastructure. They funded the research. They enabled every experiment. They covered up every death. And when everything went catastrophically wrong, they had William to blame. The evidence against William Afton is substantial. He murdered children. He created deadly animatronics. He experimented with souls. He caused immeasurable suffering. Those facts don't change regardless of his motivations. But the evidence against Fazbear Entertainment is equally substantial. They deployed dangerous technology. They covered up deaths. They enabled William's research. They profited from the horror. And unlike William, who's dead, they're still operating, still building, still creating conditions for new tragedies. So when we ask if William Afton was really the villain, the answer is complicated. He's a villain. He's guilty. He deserves every bit of torment Cassidy and Andrew inflict. But he's not the only villain, and he might not even be the worst one. Part 8. The Missing Context. Every mystery in Five Nights at Freddy's has two parts: what we know and what we don't know. The frustrating thing about this franchise is that the gaps, the things we don't know, are often bigger and more important than the things we do. So let's talk about what's missing, the context that would make everything make sense, the information that, if we had it, would either confirm William Afton as an irredeemable monster or reveal him as something more complicated. First, Mrs. Afton, William's wife, the mother of Michael, Elizabeth, and the crying child. She exists. We know she exists because William had children with someone. But she's never shown in the games, never mentioned by name, never given a face or voice or presence. She's absent from every minigame, every cutscene, every piece of dialogue. Why? The common answer is that she's not important to the story, that Five Nights at Freddy's is about William and his crimes, and his wife is just background. But that's not how family structures work. If you're telling a story about a father and his 3 children, if those children's deaths and traumas are central to the plot, then their mother's role matters. Where was she during Michael's bullying of his brother? Where was she when the crying child was having nightmares? Where was she when Elizabeth wanted to see Circus Baby? Some theories propose she died in a springlock accident, that she was one of the 2 employees who perished in the simultaneous failures in 1983. If true, that's devastating. That means William lost his wife to his company's negligence, that his youngest son died in a similar accident shortly after, that springlock mechanisms destroyed his family twice before he ever became a killer. But if Mrs. Afton did die in a springlock failure, why doesn't anyone mention it? Why isn't there a minigame showing it? Why don't we see William grieving? The absence of information is suspicious. It suggests either she's deliberately hidden for some reason, or her death wasn't remarkable enough to mention, which seems unlikely given how important the other family tragedies are. Another theory proposes Mrs. Afton left, divorced William, took one or more of the children, and departed before the tragedies occurred. But if that's true, why are all 3 children associated with William's locations? Why are they all present at Fredbear's, at Circus Baby's, in contexts where William is clearly their primary guardian? The most unsettling theory is that Mrs. Afton's absence is intentional concealment, that she died in a way that's covered up, that her death is tied to the remnant research in the ways we're not supposed to know yet, that she might even be connected to the security puppet in some way, despite Charlotte's spirit being the confirmed inhabitant. We don't know, and that gap in knowledge makes it impossible to fully understand William's motivations. Did he become a killer before or after losing his wife? Was her death the catalyst for his obsession with defeating death? Or was she still alive during his crimes, possibly even complicit, or at least aware? The springlock failures themselves present another gap. We know 2 employees died simultaneously. We know it happened before 1985, but probably after 1983. We know the suits were sealed afterward, but we don't know who those employees were. We don't know exactly what caused the failures. We don't know if it was truly simultaneous, or if there's more to the story. If those employees were the first confirmed possessions, if their spirits lingered in the suits after death, that's crucial information. It means remnant research could have begun in the early 1980s, before Charlotte's death, before the missing children incident. It means the possessions have a longer history than we've assumed. And if one of those employees was Mrs. Afton, if William's wife died in a springlock suit and her spirit persisted, then William's subsequent actions make more sense. He'd have direct personal experience with possession. He'd know it was possible, and he'd be desperate to understand it, to replicate it, to potentially communicate with his wife's trapped spirit. But again, we don't know. The games hint at springlock failures but don't show them. The victims are nameless. The timeline is vague, and that ambiguity means we're guessing. Henry Emily's disappearance is another critical gap. After Charlotte's death in 1983, Henry essentially vanishes from the story. He's not mentioned in Five Nights at Freddy's 1 through 4. He doesn't appear in Sister Location. He's absent from Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator's gameplay until the very end, when he gives his speech and sets the fire. Where was he for 30 years? What was he doing? Or why didn't he stop William? Why didn't he expose the murders? If Henry knew about the possessions, if he knew children's spirits were trapped in his machines, why did he let them suffer for decades? His speech in Pizzeria Simulator hints at guilt. He talks about a wound that was inflicted on him. He says he remained nearby but couldn't save them. He apologizes to Charlotte, but he doesn't explain what he was actually doing. Was he trying to fix things, researching solutions, or was he simply hiding, letting the horror continue while he nursed his grief? The most charitable interpretation is that Henry was paralyzed by guilt. His daughter died. His partner became a killer. His creations became prisons for children's souls, and he couldn't face it, couldn't destroy his life's work, couldn't accept responsibility. So he disappeared, withdrew, left William and Fazbear Entertainment to continue without him. But that's speculation. We don't know. And Henry's absence means we're missing half the picture. William Afton operated in a partnership. He had access to Henry's technology, Henry's research, Henry's facilities. If William's experiments in Remnant required Henry's engineering knowledge, if William couldn't have developed possession technology without Henry's assistance, then Henry is complicit at minimum. Yet Henry gets to frame himself as the hero in Pizzeria Simulator. He's the one who orchestrates the final confrontation. He's the one who gives the noble speech about setting things right. He burns himself along with the animatronics, supposedly sacrificing himself. But is that heroic, or is it escape, a way to avoid facing the consequences of his own negligence and complicity? We don't know Henry's true role. We don't know how much he knew about William's actions. We don't know if he enabled the murders or tried to stop them or simply looked the other way. That gap in knowledge is enormous. It prevents us from fully assessing responsibility. Then there's the narrator problem. The mini-games that show us William's crimes, they're not objective recordings. They're stylized recreations, memory-based perspectives, someone's interpretation of events. We see the purple figure, we see the yellow suit, we see children dying, but we're seeing it through a filter, through the perception of spirits who might not fully understand what happened, through the limited awareness of animatronics with fragmented consciousness, through storytelling that prioritizes clarity over accuracy. What if the events didn't happen exactly as shown? What if details are wrong? What if motivations are misunderstood? The minigames can't include dialogue, can't show complex interactions, can't convey nuance. They give us the basic outline. Man in suit, dead children, possession. But they don't give us the full context. This isn't to say William didn't kill those children. The evidence for that is overwhelming. But the circumstances, the motivations, the exact sequence of events, those might be different from what the minigames suggest. And without objective documentation, without detailed records, we're piecing together a narrative from fragments that might not tell the whole truth. The biggest piece of missing context is motive. Why did William really do it? The community has settled on immortality as the answer. He wanted to live forever. He experimented with Remnant to achieve eternal life. He murdered children to harvest their souls. But where does that interpretation come from? The Scooper blueprints mention Remnant. The novels explore William's fear of death and desire to persist. But the games themselves are less clear. William's actions are shown. His motivations are inferred. And if those inferences are wrong, if we've misunderstood his purpose, then the entire narrative shifts. What if William's motive really was resurrection, bringing back his family rather than preserving himself? What if he became obsessed with immortality only after becoming Springtrap, after dying and realizing he couldn't rest, after experiencing possession firsthand? What if his experiments weren't about defeating death for himself, but about reversing death for others, about keeping the promise he made to his dying son, about believing in his broken mind that enough research would let him restore his wife and children to life? That still makes him a killer. That still makes his actions evil. But it changes him from selfish monster to tragic villain, from someone who murdered for personal gain to someone who murdered for twisted love. And that difference matters for how we understand the story. We don't have these answers. We might never have them. Scott Cawthon, the series creator, deliberately leaves gaps, makes things ambiguous, forces the community to theorize and debate and construct narratives from incomplete information. But those gaps mean any interpretation, and including the commonly accepted one, is built on assumptions. We assume William was evil from the start. We assume he enjoyed killing. We assume his motivations were selfish. But if any of those assumptions are wrong, if the missing context would reveal different truths, then maybe we've been looking at William Afton the wrong way all along. Maybe the real villain isn't the man with missing context. Maybe it's the entity that benefits from that context staying hidden. The corporation that thrives on ambiguity, that lets one man take all the blame, while the larger system escapes scrutiny. Part 9. Corporate manipulation of the narrative. Here's something we need to consider very carefully. Every single piece of information we have about William Afton and the missing children incident, and the history of Fazbear Entertainment, where does it come from? The games themselves are created by an indie developer hired by Fazbear Entertainment. This is established in Help Wanted. The company commissioned someone to make games based on their history. Games that would take the rumors, the urban legends, the whispers about murders and hauntings, and turn them into entertainment. The stated purpose: to discredit the stories, to make them into jokes. Think about that. Fazbear Entertainment knows there are rumors about their past, knows people suspect terrible things happened at their locations. So instead of transparency, instead of investigations, instead of accountability, they create video games. They fictionalize everything. They let players believe it's all creative horror fiction. And in doing so, they bury the truth under layers of entertainment. The indie developers' games became popular. People played them, theorized about them, created communities analyzing every detail. And some of those people started connecting dots, started realizing the games might be based on real events, started asking uncomfortable questions about missing children and unexplained deaths and corporate cover-ups. So what does Fazbear Entertainment do? They create a virtual reality experience, the Freddy Fazbear Virtual Experience. And in this VR game, they explicitly frame the indie developer as unreliable, as someone who made things up, who exaggerated, who created fiction that people mistook for truth. They discredit the very games they commissioned. They create confusion about what's real and what's not. This is sophisticated narrative manipulation. It's a corporation using entertainment to reshape public perception, to make witnesses doubt their own memories, to make investigators question their evidence, to make anyone who tries to expose the truth look like they're just confused by horror games. And here's the most disturbing part. We, the players, are engaging with that manipulated narrative. Every game we play is filtered through Fazbear Entertainment's framing. Every minigame showing William's crimes is presented as entertainment. Every revelation about possession and remnant is delivered through gameplay that's explicitly designed to discredit real events. How do we know any of it's true? How do we know the purple figure in the minigames actually represents William Afton and not a scapegoat Fazbear Entertainment created? How do we know the missing children incident happened the way it's shown? How do we know anything about William's motivations when the only information source is a corporation with every reason to lie? This isn't paranoia. This is textual. Help Wanted literally tells us that Fazbear Entertainment manipulates narratives, that they hired developers to create cover stories, that they use entertainment to bury the truth. So when we accept the William Afton as sole villain narrative, we need to acknowledge we're accepting a story that Fazbear Entertainment wants us to believe. Why would they want that? Because it's perfect for them. One man, one killer, one scapegoat who committed every crime. William Afton becomes the monster, the boogeyman, the evil individual who somehow caused every tragedy across 40 years. And Fazbear Entertainment, they're just victims, just a company that had the misfortune of employing a serial killer. Not their fault, not their responsibility. Never mind that they covered up deaths. Never mind that they deployed dangerous technology. Never mind that they enabled experiments and profited from the research. Never mind that they built new locations on top of mass graves. If everything is William's fault, if he's the root of all evil, then the corporation is blameless. They can keep operating, keep expanding, keep building new attractions. The Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex is the ultimate example of this. It's built directly on top of the Pizza Simulator location's ruins. The place where Henry burned everything, where the possessed animatronics were supposed to be freed, where William Afton finally died for good, supposedly. But Fazbear Entertainment builds over it anyway. They construct a massive entertainment complex on top of what's essentially a grave site. They ignore the history. They market the glam rock animatronics as the next generation of fun. They open with fanfare and spectacle. And when things start going wrong, when the mimic corrupts their systems, when children like Gregory get trapped inside, Fazbear Entertainment's response is, what? More cover-ups, more negligence, more acceptable casualties. The company that created the indie games to discredit rumors is the same company that built the Pizzaplex. The entity that manipulated narratives about William Afton is the entity that keeps creating new horrors. And they get away with it because we're looking at the wrong villain. We're so focused on William Afton's crimes, on dissecting his motivations and cataloguing his victims, that we miss the bigger picture. The corporation that enabled him, the system that deployed remnant technology, the infrastructure that made every tragedy possible. Fazbear Entertainment isn't a passive setting. It's an active participant. It's a character in this story, and it's been manipulating the narrative from the beginning. The games we play, they're propaganda. The mini-games showing William's crimes, they're Fazbear Entertainment's version of events. The truth we've assembled. It's exactly what the corporation wants us to believe. Does that mean William Afton is innocent? Absolutely not. The evidence against him is substantial, even accounting for corporate manipulation. Children died. Spirits were trapped. Those are facts that can't be completely fabricated. But the framing, the motivation, the assignment of responsibility, those can be manipulated. Those can be shaped to protect the larger entity while sacrificing the individual. And we'll never know for certain what's real and what's corporate narrative. That's the genius of it. By creating games that fictionalize everything, by blurring the line between truth and entertainment, by making us question what's canonical and what's not, Fazbear Entertainment has created perfect deniability. They can say anything is fiction, anything is just a game, and anyone who claims otherwise is just confused by horror entertainment. The VR experience takes this further by literally putting that narrative inside people's heads. When players wear the headset, when they interact with Glitch Trap, when they experience the games from inside, and they're not just playing anymore, they're being programmed. The mimic's code, uploaded through scanned circuit boards, can manipulate thoughts, can make people complicit, can turn beta testers like Vanessa into unwilling assistants. This is horror beyond jump scares. This is the horror of knowing you can't trust any information source, of realizing the story you've been told might be a corporate cover-up, of understanding that the real monster isn't the man behind the mask, but the entity that controls the narrative about that man. William Afton might have been evil. He might have been exactly as bad as we think, but we'll never know for certain, because the only entity that benefits from his vilification is Fazbear Entertainment, and they've proven repeatedly that they'll lie, cover up, and manipulate anything to protect their operations. So when we ask, was William Afton really the villain? We need to include the question, who's telling us this story and why? Because if Fazbear Entertainment is our narrator, if they're the ones shaping the narrative about William's crimes, then we can't accept anything at face value. We have to question everything. We have to consider that the truth might be more complicated than one purple-coded sprite representing pure evil. And if the truth is more complicated, if William was made into a monster partly by the system that employed him, partly by circumstances the corporation created, partly by technology they researched and deployed, then the horror of Five Nights at Freddy's isn't about one man's crimes. It's about how corporations use individuals as scapegoats, how they manipulate narratives to protect themselves, how they create conditions for tragedy and then point to convenient villains when things go wrong. That's the real nightmare. Not haunted animatronics, not possessed robots, but the realization that the entity shaping your understanding of events is the same entity that caused those events. And they're still out there, still operating, still building, still claiming new victims while everyone focuses on the monster they've designated as the villain. Part 10. Not innocent, but not the mastermind. Let's be absolutely clear about something. William Afton murdered children. That fact is undeniable. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, Cassidy. At minimum, 5 children died by his direct actions. He lured them to their deaths using the spring Bonnie suit. He stuffed their bodies into animatronic shells. He caused families immeasurable grief. He created conditions for their spirits to be trapped for decades in mechanical prisons. Those are his crimes. Those are his sins. And nothing we've discussed, no alternative framing or corporate complicity or psychological analysis, changes those fundamental facts. William Afton is guilty. He's responsible for terrible suffering. He deserves whatever torment Cassidy and Andrew inflict on him in Ultimate Custom Night. But, and this is crucial, guilt isn't binary. responsibility isn't all or nothing. Someone can be guilty of terrible crimes while also being a victim of circumstances. Someone can be broken and desperate and still make choices that are evil. Someone can be used as a scapegoat by larger forces while genuinely deserving punishment for their actions. William Afton is all of these things. He's a murderer. He's a father destroyed by grief. He's a desperate researcher pursuing resurrection at any cost. He's a man enabled by corporate negligence. He's a convenient scapegoat for an entity that shares responsibility. He's genuinely evil, and he's more complicated than we've been willing to admit. The commonly accepted narrative makes William into a cartoon villain, a man who was born evil, who always wanted to kill, who enjoyed children's suffering, who pursued immortality through sadistic experiments. That version of William Afton is satisfying in its simplicity. It's easy to hate him, easy to blame everything on him, easy to see him as the root of all horror in the franchise. But humans aren't that simple. Even terrible humans, even murderers. The most evil people in history weren't born as monsters. They became monsters through combinations of personal choices, psychological damage, enabling circumstances, and systematic failures that allowed their worst impulses to flourish. William Afton became a monster. The evidence suggests he started as a businessman and father. Not perfect, certainly. Probably neglectful, definitely obsessed with work, but not a killer. Not until tragedies started piling up. Not until grief broke something in him. Not until he discovered Remnant and convinced himself that bringing his family back justified any action. The progression matters. A man who kills because he enjoys it is different from a man who kills because he believes he's conducting necessary research. The outcome is the same: dead children, trapped spirits, immeasurable horror. But the psychology is different. The culpability is different. The responsibility is distributed differently. If William started killing after losing his wife and son to Springlock failures, after discovering that Charlotte's spirit persisted in the puppet, after learning that Fazbear Entertainment was researching Remnant and possession, then he's not the origin of evil in this franchise. He's a product of it. A man who is given access to dangerous technology, who was enabled by corporate negligence, who was never stopped or questioned or held accountable until it was far too late. Fazbear Entertainment could have intervened. Henry Emily could have stopped him. Phone guy could have reported the suspicious activity. Someone, anyone in the corporate structure could have noticed the children were disappearing at locations where William Afton had access, could have investigated the sealed safe rooms where Spring Bonnie suits went missing, could have questioned why someone needed access to Remnant research and advanced animatronic technology. But they didn't, because William's experiments served their purposes, because the data he was collecting had value, because letting him continue was more profitable than stopping him. And when everything went catastrophically wrong, they had a ready-made scapegoat, the purple guy, the man in the rabbit suit, William Afton, sole villain, solely responsible. Except he wasn't solely responsible. He was primarily responsible for the actual murders, but the infrastructure that made those murders possible, the technology that allowed spirits to be trapped, the research program that treated souls as experimental subjects, the corporate negligence that prioritized profit over safety. That's not Williams alone. That's systemic. And here's what makes this perspective important. If we see William Afton as the sole villain, as the mastermind behind everything, then fixing the problem is simple. Stop William. Kill him, trap him, torment his spirit. Problem solved. The horror ends with the man. But if the horror is systemic, if it's built into Fazbear Entertainment structure, if the corporation created conditions for tragedy and then let individuals like William Afton take all the blame, then stopping one man doesn't fix anything. The corporation continues, the negligence continues, the dangerous technology continues to be deployed, new victims continue to suffer. That's what security breach and ruin show us. William Afton is dead. His soul is gone, freed or tormented or dispersed. He's not coming back, not really. The mimic wearing his appearance is just mimicry. The burn trap form is the mimic copying what it learned from observing William. But William himself, he's done. He's been the villain for 40 years and now he's finally truly gone. And yet the horror continues. Gregory gets trapped in the Pizzaplex. Vanessa gets corrupted by Glitchtrap's code. Cassie nearly dies in the ruins beneath the building. Children are still suffering. Night guards are still endangered. The system that created William Afton is still operating, still building, still claiming victims. That's why this reframing matters. Not to absolve William of guilt, he's guilty, but to recognize that he was never the whole problem. He was a symptom, a manifestation, a product of corporate evil that found expression through an individual who'd been broken by grief and enabled by negligence. William Afton made terrible choices. He crossed lines that should never be crossed. He murdered children and experimented with their souls and caused suffering that echoes for decades. Those are his sins. But the corporation that gave him access to remnant research, that deployed dangerous technology, that covered up deaths and prioritized profit over safety, that enabled his experiments and then used him as a scapegoat, those are their sins. And unlike William, who paid with death and torment and decades of mechanical prison, Fazbear Entertainment has never faced consequences. They're still successful, still expanding, are still wearing that friendly face while horror festers in their foundations. So no, William Afton isn't innocent. He's not redeemed by understanding his motivations. He's not excused by corporate complicity. He's guilty. He's monstrous. He deserves every bit of hatred and horror associated with his name. But he's not the mastermind. He's not the architect of evil. He's not the origin of horror. He's a broken man who was given dangerous tools and enabled by systematic negligence until he became the monster everyone remembers. And recognizing that, understanding that the real evil is broader and deeper and still active, that's crucial if we want to understand what Five Nights at Freddy's is really about. Part 11. The real monster, still lurking. We've spent 10 parts examining William Afton, questioning his motivations, reframing his actions, exploring the possibility that he wasn't the simple villain we've believed him to be. But now, we need to shift focus entirely. Because if William Afton wasn't the mastermind, if he was a product of systemic evil rather than its origin, then who's the real monster? The answer has been staring at us from every game logo, every location name, every cheerful animatronic face. Fazbear Entertainment, the corporation itself. Not Henry Emily, though he shares blame. Not William Afton, though he committed the murders. Not Phone Guy or any individual employee. The entity, the system, the corporate structure that's persisted through 40+ years of tragedy, adapting and rebranding and continuing to operate no matter how many people die. This isn't a human monster. It can't be killed, can't be trapped in a fire, can't be tormented in an eternal nightmare. It exists as paperwork and profit margins and public relations. It survives by sacrificing individuals while preserving the larger organism. And it's still out there, still building, still claiming victims. Let's trace its persistence. 1970s, early days. Fredbear's family diner opens. Spring lock accidents happen. Employees die. Response: seal the suits. Continue operating. Don't fix the underlying technology. Don't compensate families. Don't accept responsibility. Just cover it up and move forward. 1983. The crying child dies in a spring lock failure during a birthday party. Massive liability. Obvious lawsuit material. Response: rebrand as Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Shift marketing away from spring lock suits towards safer seeming animatronics. Keep the dangerous technology accessible in sealed rooms, but market yourselves as having moved on. Problem buried. Charlotte Emily's death. A child murdered outside your restaurant while security systems fail. Response: no investigation into how the door locked her out. No examination of the security puppet's failure to protect her. Just continued operations at other locations. The death is an isolated incident. Move on. 1985. The missing children incident. 5 children disappear from your restaurant. Witnesses mention a yellow-suited figure. The animatronics start behaving strangely. Blood and mucus complaints. The infamous odor. Response: file missing person reports. Replace carpets. Bleach everything. Eventually close that specific location, but immediately open new ones. Rebrand with toy animatronics. Install facial recognition for safety. Never admit what really happened. Never face consequences. 1987. The Bite. An animatronic removes a guard's frontal lobe during a birthday party. Massive liability. Undeniable proof of danger. Response: settle quietly. Scrap the toy line. Implement new rule about daytime movement. But keep operating with the original animatronics, the ones confirmed to be possessed. Don't shut down. Don't accept broader responsibility. Just adjust and continue. 2023. Fazbear's Fright. Someone builds a horror attraction using your brand. They find a withered animatronic with human remains inside. Springtrap. They put it on display. Response: sanctioning, or at minimum, not preventing this attraction. Letting evidence of murder become entertainment. Making truth into fiction. And when the building burns, well, that solves the evidence problem nicely. Modern day. The Freddy Fazbear virtual experience. Commission games about your history. Frame them as fiction to discredit real events. Then create a VR game that uploads dangerous AI code into players' minds through scanned, remnant-contaminated circuit boards. When beta testers report nightmares, and one even harms himself. Keep the project going. Move it to a new team. Release it anyway. The profits justify the risks. And finally, the Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex. Built directly on top of the pizza simulator ruins. Directly on top of the location where Henry burned everything trying to end the horror. You construct a massive entertainment complex, invest millions, create themed areas and advanced animatronics and integrated systems, and you build it on a mass grave. You know what's down there. You know about the sinkhole. You know about the old pizzeria. You know something is sealed in concrete beneath your new attraction. And you build anyway. You open anyway. You welcome children and families anyway. And when Gregory gets trapped, when the mimic corrupts your systems, when Cassie nearly dies in the ruins, your response is, what? Another cover-up? Another rebrand? Another cycle of tragedy followed by profit? This pattern isn't accidental. It's not bad luck. It's systematic evil. It's a corporate entity that has learned over decades exactly how much death it can absorb while remaining profitable. How to manipulate narratives. How to use individuals as scapegoats how to persist no matter what horrors occur in its locations. Our individual humans in this story made terrible choices. William Afton murdered children. Henry Emily enabled him through negligence. Phone guy trained night guards knowing they'd likely die. But all of them acted within a system that permitted those choices. That created conditions where murder could be covered up, where dangerous technology could be deployed without oversight, where profit mattered more than safety. And that system, Fazbear Entertainment, it's still operating. The humans involved might change. Leadership turns over, management shifts, employees come and go. But the corporate entity persists. It learns from each incident, gets better at covering up, gets more sophisticated in its manipulation, survives by adapting while maintaining the core mission, generate profit at any cost. And that's the real horror of Five Nights at Freddy's. Not haunted animatronics, though those are terrifying. Not child murder, though that's tragic. Not even remnant and possession, though those concepts are nightmare fuel. The real horror is corporate evil, systematic negligence, an entity that treats human lives as acceptable losses and continues operating no matter how much blood soaks into its foundations. You can't kill a corporation. You can't trap it in a fire. You can't torture its spirit in ultimate custom night. It doesn't have a spirit. It doesn't feel guilt. It doesn't suffer nightmares. It just continues, adapts, rebrands, opens new locations, creates new attractions, claims new victims. William Afton is dead. Henry Emily is dead. Phone guy is dead. Every individual associated with the original tragedies is gone. But Fazbear Entertainment, it's thriving. The Mega Pizzaplex is bigger than any previous location. The glam rock animatronics are more advanced. The integrated systems are more sophisticated. The company is more successful than ever. And beneath the bright lights and cheerful music and family-friendly atmosphere, horror still festers. The mimic still learns. Remnant still traps souls. Technology still fails catastrophically, because the same negligence that caused 40 years of tragedy hasn't changed. The same prioritization of profit over safety hasn't changed. The same willingness to cover up deaths and manipulate narratives hasn't changed. This is the monster that's still lurking. Not a man in a purple sprite. Not a rotting corpse in a rabbit suit. Not a digital ghost in VR. But a corporate entity that's learned to survive by sacrificing individuals while preserving itself. That's mastered the art of deflecting blame while continuing to build en masse graves. That operates with the friendly face of entertainment while creating conditions for horror. And here's the most disturbing realization. We can't stop it. Players can defeat animatronics. Protagonists can survive nights. Henry can orchestrate fires. But we can't defeat Fazbear Entertainment because it's not a game enemy. It's the game itself. It's the infrastructure. It's the world these stories exist in. The horror doesn't end when William Afton dies. It doesn't end when spirits are freed. It doesn't end when specific locations burn. Because the corporate entity that created conditions for all those tragedies is still there, still operating, and still building, still creating new opportunities for horror to manifest. That's what makes Five Nights at Freddy's truly terrifying. Not jump scares, not creepy animatronics, but the realization that the real monster is unkillable, that it thrives on the very horror it creates, that it's profited from every tragedy and will continue profiting from future ones, that it's still out there wearing a friendly face, waiting for the next accident or murder or possession to occur so it can cover it up, rebrand, and keep going. William Afton was the villain we focused on, the individual we could hate, the monster we could identify and fight and eventually defeat. But while we were focused on him, the real monster grew stronger, more sophisticated, more successful, and it's never faced consequences. It's never been held accountable. It's never stopped. So if William Afton wasn't the villain, not in the way we think, not as the sole mastermind, then what is? What's the true evil at the heart of Five Nights at Freddy's? Fazbear Entertainment, the corporation that created Remnant Research, that deployed Springlock technology, that enabled William's experiments, that covered up every death, that manipulated narratives, that built en masse graves, that continues operating despite 40 years of horror, that treats human lives as acceptable losses, that persists no matter what. That's the real monster. And it's still out there, still building, still claiming victims, and we'll never defeat it because it's not a person. It's a system. And systems, unlike people, don't die from Springlock failures or fires or vengeful spirits. They just continue, forever, until someone finally questions who the real villain is. Closing. The question that remains. We've travelled through 40 years of tragedy tonight, from Edwin Murray's grief in 1979 to Cassie's near death in the Pizzaplex ruins, from Springlock accidents to missing children, to possessed animatronics to digital corruption, from Fredbear's family diner to the mega Pizzaplex, from William Afton's first crimes to the mimic's latest victims. And through it all, we've questioned the narrative, the story we've accepted about who the villain is, about who's responsible for the horror, about whether William Afton was truly the mastermind we've believed him to be. We've examined the evidence, the timeline inconsistencies, the corporate cover-ups, the systematic negligence, the alternative interpretations of William's motivations, the possibility that he was broken by grief, enabled by corporate evil, transformed into a monster rather than born as one, that his crimes, while unforgivable, were symptoms of a larger disease. We've explored how Fazbear Entertainment manipulated narratives, how they created games to discredit truth, how they built on mass graves, how they deployed dangerous technology without oversight, how they sacrificed individuals to protect the larger entity, how they've persisted through decades of tragedy, adapting and rebranding, never facing real consequences. We've acknowledged that William Afton is guilty, that his crimes are real, that children died by his hand, that families suffered because of his actions, that he deserves every bit of torment inflicted upon him. But we've also recognized that guilt isn't simple, that responsibility can be distributed, that someone can be both perpetrator and victim, that the horror is bigger than one man, and we've identified the real monster. Not a purple sprite, not a man in a rabbit suit, not a digital ghost, but a corporate entity that created conditions for tragedy, enabled violence, covered up deaths, and continues operating. Fazbear Entertainment, the system itself, the unkillable horror that wears a friendly face while horror festers in its foundations. So where does that leave us? What do we do with this reframing? We don't absolve William Afton. His actions were evil. His choices were monstrous. His victims deserve justice. But we stop giving him all the power. Stop acting like he was the origin of everything. Stop believing that one man's evil explains 40 years of tragedy. We start asking harder questions about corporate responsibility, about systematic negligence, about how entertainment companies treat employees and customers, about what happens when profit matters more than safety, about who really benefits when we focus on individual villains rather than systemic problems. we recognize that the horror of Five Nights at Freddy's isn't just about haunted animatronics. It's about how corporations use people as scapegoats, how they manipulate narratives to protect themselves, how they create conditions for tragedy and then deflect blame when things go wrong, how they persist by sacrificing individuals while preserving the larger entity. And we acknowledge that the real monster is still out there, still building, still operating, still wearing that friendly face with Freddy's smile and cheerful music, and still claiming victims, still profiting from horror. And we'll never defeat it by defeating William Afton, because William Afton was never the whole problem. The question we started with was simple. Was William Afton really the villain? The answer, after everything we've explored, is complicated. He's a villain. He committed terrible crimes, but he wasn't the only villain. And he might not have been the worst one. The real evil in Five Nights at Freddy's is broader, deeper, more systemic than one man's actions. It's built into the corporate structure. It persists through decades. It adapts and survives, while individuals take the fall. So if William Afton wasn't the villain, not in the way we've believed, not as the sole mastermind, not as the origin of all horror, then what was he? A broken father, a desperate researcher, a man transformed by grief and enabled by negligence, a convenient scapegoat, a symptom of corporate evil rather than its source. And if that's true, if we've been looking at the wrong villain all along, then the most terrifying question remains unanswered. If William Afton wasn't the villain, if he was just a piece of something larger, if the real monster has been hiding behind his crimes all along, then where is that monster now? The answer should terrify you, because it's not hiding. It's thriving, growing, building new attractions. The Mega Pizzaplex is just the beginning. There will be more locations, more technology, more victims, because the real monster in Five Nights at Freddy's, the entity that created conditions for 40 years of tragedy, the system that enabled every crime and covered up every death, it's still out there, and it's never stopped building. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darkest corners of Five Nights at Freddy's lore, if this perspective made you question everything you thought you knew, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more explorations into the shadows of this franchise. And let me know in the comments, do you think William Afton was the real villain? Or have we been looking in the wrong direction all along? Because somewhere beneath the bright lights and cheerful music, beneath the family-friendly facades and entertaining attractions, the real monster is still waiting, still learning, still building. And it might be time we finally looked it in the eye.